Follow your passion. Picture the guidance counselor's office. Beige walls, a clock that ticks louder than it should, and a 16-year-old staring at a worksheet with one question at the top. What are you passionate about? The pen doesn't move. Nothing comes. And somewhere in that silence, a tiny, quiet panic starts. Like, maybe everyone else got handed a destiny at birth, and the box where yours should be just came up empty. Here's what nobody tells that kid. Passion isn't something you find lying around, fully formed, waiting to be discovered like a key under a doormat. It's closer to a campfire. Nobody walks into the woods and stumbles on a fire already burning, ready-made, just for them. You build it. You kneel down. You gather the smallest, driest twigs, first the boring stuff, the stuff that barely catches, and only after that tiny flame holds do you feed it anything bigger. The fire doesn't come before the effort. The effort is the fire, slowly. Psychologists actually tested this. Researchers at Stanford ran people through a tedious, difficult intellectual task and split them by belief. Some held what's called a fixed theory of passion, the idea that interest is something you either have for a thing or don't. Others held a growth theory, that interest is built like a callus through exposure and friction. The fixed theory group lost interest fast the moment things got boring or hard. The growth theory group stayed in it. Same task, same difficulty. The only difference was what they believed passion was made of. So, follow your passion has the order backwards. It's not passion, then mastery. It's small, dumb, repetitive competence first, and passion grows out of that, the way warmth grows out of friction, not the other way around. Which means that kid in the beige office, pen frozen, empty worksheet there was never a missing box. There was just a fire that hadn't been lit yet. And lighting one never required knowing, in advance, exactly what it was going to become. Fake it till you make it. The first day in a new role, the desk too clean, the chair adjusted by someone else, and that low hum in the chest that says everyone here can tell I don't belong. So you do what the advice says. You stand a little taller, lower your voice half an octave, nod like you already know the answer before the question's finished. And it works. Sort of. People believe you, which is exactly the strange part, because the advice was sold on a promise it can't keep, that acting confident makes you confident, from the inside out, like flipping a switch in your own chemistry. There was even a famous study built on that promise stand, like a superhero for 2 minutes, hands on hips, chest open, and your cortisol drops, your testosterone rises, your body believes the pose. Millions watched the talk. Years later, the lab couldn't get the hormone results to show up again. Not in bigger samples, not in cleaner conditions. The chemical magic trick wasn't real. What's real is smaller and a little less flattering. You don't fool your own nervous system. Your hands still shake under the table, but other people only see the table's surface. The voice, the posture, the nod, and they respond to that. They treat you like someone competent, which gives you slightly more room to act like one, which sometimes, slowly, turns into actually becoming one. Psychologists call it self-perception. You watch your own behavior the same way a stranger would, and start drawing conclusions about yourself from it. The fake isn't rewiring you directly. It's rewiring the room, and the room is rewiring you back. But notice what that leaves out. If the performance is good enough, nobody corrects you, and the correction was the whole point. The terrified new hire who can't admit she's lost never gets shown what she's actually doing wrong, because no one around her thinks to explain it. She fooled the room right out of the one thing that would have actually made her good. So the fire under "fake it till you make it" isn't fraud, and it isn't magic either. It's a slow transaction between you and other people's eyes, and like any transaction, it's only as good as what it quietly costs you to keep paying. Just be yourself. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes right before you knock on a door you've never knocked on before: a first date, a new friend's apartment, a family gathering you're meeting for the first time. And in that half-second, a small command runs through your head, the one everyone's been repeating since you were a kid. Just be yourself. As if yourself were a single, fixed, retrievable thing, sitting in a drawer somewhere, waiting to be put on like a coat. But notice the strange demand underneath that advice. Which self? The one you are with your oldest friend, loose and loud and a little crude? Or the one you are at your grandmother's table, careful with your language, sitting up straighter without deciding to? Both are real. Neither is fake, and that's the quiet problem. The advice assumes there's one true version of you, underneath all the others, when what's actually underneath is more like a chord than a single note. Psychologists who study the self this way describe it less as a fixed object and more as a structure with many rooms, self-complexity. They call it different versions of you activated by different rooms, different people, different stakes. You're not hiding the real one when you adjust. You're just turning on a different light. There's research on this in dating, oddly enough. People told to just be themselves on a first date often do worse, not because they're boring, but because they default to whichever version of themselves takes the least effort, instead of the version actually suited to the room they're in. The people who do better are the ones who read the situation and adjust deliberately, what researchers call self-monitoring, and it isn't fakery, it's calibration. A pianist doesn't play the same piece at a funeral and a wedding because one performance is fake. They're both real, they're just tuned to where they are. So when the advice tells you to drop the performance and just be, it's mistaking the act of tuning for the act of lying. The real question waiting on the other side of that door was never, which version of me is the true one? It was always, which version of me does this room actually need? Everything happens for a reason. The hospital waiting room at 3 a.m, fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly ill, a vending machine humming in the corner, and someone, a nurse, a friend, a well-meaning stranger, leans in and says it softly, like a balm. Everything happens for a reason. And for a second, it works. The chaos gets folded into a story. The universe, it seems, was paying attention after all, but follow that sentence one step further than anyone usually does. If everything happens for a reason, then this, whatever brought you to this room, was also supposed to happen. Someone, somewhere, had to design the reason for a child's fever, a car accident, a diagnosis. The comfort the phrase offers only holds up if you don't look directly at what it implies, because the moment you do, the sentence stops being soothing and starts being monstrous. That's not an accident of bad luck in how the phrase gets used. It's a structural flaw baked into the sentence itself. Psychologists actually have a name for the instinct underneath it. Teleological reasoning, the mind's habit of assuming purpose behind events, even ones that are just physics, biology, or bad timing doing what they do. Studies on this find the instinct shows up shockingly early. Small children will tell you rocks are pointy, so animals can scratch on them, as if sharpness had been issued for a reason rather than simply shaped by erosion. Adults grow out of saying it that plainly, but under stress the same wiring resurfaces. We don't outgrow the instinct, we just get quieter about it. Here's the part worth sitting with, though, in the dark, when nobody's demanding an explanation from you. Meaning and reason aren't the same thing. A reason is something that was there before, pulling strings, arranging the dominoes. Meaning is something you're allowed to build after, out of whatever happened, regardless of whether anything was arranging it. You don't need the universe to have planned the bad thing in order to decide afterward what you're going to do with it. So maybe the waiting room doesn't need a reason whispered into it at 3 in the morning. Maybe it just needs someone willing to sit there in the unexplained part until morning comes anyway. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There's a particular kind of ache that shows up 2 days after you push a body too hard, not during the workout, but after, when the muscle is busy rebuilding itself slightly bigger than it was. That ache is the whole phrase, condensed into biology. Tiny tears in the fiber, repaired with a little reinforcement added on top, so the next stress hurts less. It's called hormesis, a small, controlled dose of damage that the system overcorrects for. And because it's real, because it works exactly as advertised, at the level of a torn muscle or a stressed bone, laying down extra calcium along the fracture line, the phrase borrowed that credibility and tried to spend it everywhere else. But stretch the same logic onto a mind, and the math stops holding. Researchers studying trauma have found something called a dose-response curve that isn't a straight line at all. It bends. A little adversity, survived with support and some control over the outcome, can in fact build something researchers call stress inoculation, a kind of resilience callus, not unlike the muscle. But push past a certain threshold repeated, inescapable, overwhelming, and the curve doesn't keep climbing toward stronger. It drops hard. People who endure the most severe trauma are, on average, more likely to develop PTSD, not less. And the nervous system that gets flooded past its capacity to cope doesn't toughen. It just stays flooded, jumping at sounds that shouldn't matter years later. So the phrase isn't lying exactly. It's mistaking a muscle for a mind, and forgetting that even muscles can be overtrained into injury instead of growth. The variable nobody puts in the bumper sticker is dose, and whether you had any say in receiving it, which means the quieter, less inspiring version of the saying is something closer to this. Some of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Some of it just makes you someone who flinches in doorways, and the difference usually isn't about how tough you were going in. It's about how much, and whether anyone was there to help carry it back down to a size a person could actually heal from. Live every day like it's your last. There's a particular trap in that sentence that only shows up if you actually try to follow it literally for one full day. Imagine someone genuinely doing it, quitting the job that doesn't bring joy, spending the savings, skipping the dentist appointment, telling the difficult coworker exactly what they think. It sounds liberating for about 4 hours. Then the part of you that has to live in tomorrow starts asking who's going to pay rent, who's going to deal with the cavity that's now an abscess, who's going to patch things up with the coworker you'll still be sitting next to on Monday. The sentence assumes there's no Monday. Almost everyone following it discovers there is. This is where the advice quietly breaks against something economists and psychologists both study under different names: intertemporal choice, the constant negotiation between the self, who wants something now, and the self who has to live with the consequences later. The brain doesn't actually run on one continuous you. It runs on a kind of relay race between a present self and a future self, and the future self, frustratingly, can't vote until the moment arrives. Treating every day as your last is a vote cast entirely by the present self, with the future self locked out of the room. Researchers who study this kind of short-term thinking call it hyperbolic, discounting the future, even your own, gets discounted in value the further away it sits, until it barely registers as real, and there's a stranger twist hiding underneath the famous version of this advice, the Steve Jobs Stanford speech that made the phrase iconic. He used it as a filter for one specific decision. Am I about to do something out of fear of disappointing someone, instead of out of what I actually want? That's a narrow, useful tool. It was never meant to be a daily operating system for grocery shopping and dentist appointments and long-term relationships, all of which depend entirely on the boring promise that tomorrow is coming and you'll still be a person who has to live in it. So the honest version of the advice isn't live like there's no tomorrow. It's closer to occasionally check whether today's choices are being made by fear or by what you'd actually choose if fear weren't in the room, and then go ahead and floss anyway, because the future self showing up tomorrow is going to need those teeth. Don't sweat the small stuff. There's a particular Sunday night feeling, laundry still in the dryer, an email unanswered, a dish in the sink from 3 days ago, where the advice arrives like a hand on the shoulder. Don't sweat the small stuff, and for the big things, the real catastrophes, it's good advice. Nobody needs reminding that a dirty dish doesn't deserve the same weight as a diagnosis. The problem is what the phrase quietly assumes about how small things actually function in a life. It treats them like isolated specks of dust, harmless on their own, beneath your attention. But small stuff rarely stays small. It accumulates. There's a concept in psychology called allostatic load, the slow, cumulative wear that stress puts on the body, not from one big shock, but from many tiny ones that never get resolved. A single unpaid bill is nothing. 12 small, unresolved things, sitting open in the back of your mind at once, behave less like 12 specks of dust and more like 12 tiny weights hung on the same hook. The hook doesn't care that each weight, individually, was small. It only cares about the sum. Researchers studying chronic stress find that it's often these accumulated minor hassles, not the rare big crises that predict anxiety and health problems more reliably, precisely because nobody grants them permission to matter. There's also a quieter mechanism at play, something cognitive scientists call the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished tasks occupy more mental space than finished ones, looping in the background like an open tab, whether or not you're consciously sweating them. Telling yourself not to sweat the small stuff doesn't close the tab. It just tells you to stop looking at it while it keeps running. So the advice isn't wrong about the size of the dish in the sink. It's wrong about what size has to do with weight. The small stuff was never dangerous because it was big. It was dangerous because it was numerous, and numerous, left alone, long enough, adds up to something that behaves exactly like the big stuff it was never supposed to resemble. Treat others how you want to be treated. There's a particular kind of well-meaning disaster that starts with a gift. Someone throws a surprise party for a friend who hates surprises, plans a loud celebration for someone who needed quiet, gives blunt, no-nonsense feedback to a person who needed to hear something gentler first, and walks away genuinely confused about why it landed badly. Every move was generous. Every move was also, secretly, about the giver. This is what I'd want. So this is what I'm giving you. That's the quiet flaw sitting inside the golden rule. It assumes other people are built roughly like you are, that your preferences are a decent stand-in for theirs. Psychologists have a name for the mental shortcut doing the damage here. The false consensus effect, the tendency to assume other people think, feel, and want what you do, simply because your own mind is the only interior you've ever had direct access to. It's not selfishness. It's a kind of unavoidable blindness. You can't run someone else's preferences through your head, so you run your own and call the output empathy. There's a sharper version of this problem in moral psychology, sometimes called the platinum rule as a correction. Treat others how they want to be treated, not how you would. It sounds like a small edit, but it requires something the golden rule quietly lets you skip, actually finding out what the other person wants, instead of assuming the answer lives inside you already. Researchers studying perspective-taking find that imagining, if I were in their position, reliably produces worse predictions about someone's needs than just directly asking them, because if I were them still runs on your own values, your own fears, your own thresholds for pain and comfort smuggled into someone else's situation. So the golden rule isn't malicious. It's just a rule built for a world with only one kind of person in it. The room is rarely that simple, and the gift that actually lands is almost never the one you'd have wanted for yourself. It's the one you went and found out they wanted instead. If you can dream it, you can achieve it. There's a particular shelf in a particular kind of bookstore, the self-help section, lit a little too warmly where this sentence shows up on a dozen covers, usually beside a sunrise or a mountain peak. It sounds like permission. It sounds like the only thing standing between you and the life you want is the size of your imagination. Dream bigger, and the achieving takes care of itself. But notice what the sentence quietly erases. Every variable that isn't you. Talent distribution, timing, money, access, luck. Survivorship bias studies this exact illusion directly. Researchers point out that motivational books and success seminars are almost always built from interviews with the people who made it, never the ones who dreamed just as hard, worked just as relentlessly, and still failed for reasons that had nothing to do with the size of their belief. The wreckage doesn't get interviewed. Only the survivors get asked what their secret was, and the secret they report, usually some version of "I just believed I could," gets mistaken for the cause, when it might have just been a thing true survivors and failures both said, except only one group got the microphone. There's a related finding in psychology called the planning fallacy, and a darker cousin of it, sometimes called illusory control. The tendency to overestimate how much of an outcome is actually steered by your own effort and belief versus randomness, structural luck, or factors entirely outside the frame. People who score high on illusory control don't just dream more. They dream the same amount as everyone else. They just trust the dream more, right up until reality disagrees with it, hard. None of this means dreaming is pointless. Dreaming sets direction. It's just not fuel, and it's definitely not a guarantee. The honest rewrite is less inspiring and more useful. If you can dream it, you might be able to build a plan toward it, work the plan, adjust the plan when the world pushes back, and even then, some of it won't be up to you. It doesn't fit as well on a sunrise poster. But it's the version that doesn't quietly blame you, later, for the parts that were never yours to control in the first place. Never go to bed angry. There's a particular 1 a.m. standoff that almost everyone in a long relationship has lived through, eyes burning. The argument long past the point of new information, both people too tired to be reasonable but too stubborn to be the one who says, "Let's just sleep on it." And hovering over the whole scene is the old rule, passed down like a law of physics. Never go to bed angry. Stay up. Resolve it. Don't let the sun rise on unfinished business. Except sleep researchers have spent decades discovering that the rule has the chemistry backwards. Anger, late at night, runs on a brain already running low on the one resource that makes good arguing possible, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for patience, nuance, and not saying the cruelest true thing you can think of. Sleep deprivation hits that exact region first and hardest. Studies on couples conflict find that fights conducted late at night, past the point of normal tiredness, are rated afterward by the same people who had them as having gone worse, said more hurtful things, and resolved less compared to the same disagreement revisited after rest. There's also a stranger, more hopeful mechanism working quietly underneath all of it. Sleep isn't just rest for an argument, it's active editing. Memory researchers have found that REM sleep in particular seems to help strip the emotional charge off a memory while leaving the content intact, a process sometimes called sleep-dependent emotional processing. You wake up still remembering what was said. You often don't wake up feeling the same screaming urgency about it. The fight that felt unsurvivable at 1 a.m. frequently looks almost trivial at 7, not because it got resolved, but because the part of the brain that was inflating it finally got to clock out. So the rule had good intentions and bad biology. The version that actually protects a relationship isn't never sleep on anger. It's closer to don't let anger go unaddressed forever, with an entirely different rule riding shotgun. It's fine, even useful, to table it for the night, as long as both people trust enough in each other to know the conversation isn't being abandoned, just postponed until two better rested brains can actually have it. Time heals all wounds. Grief doesn't arrive on a schedule, no matter how badly everyone around the grieving person wants it to. There's a particular discomfort in year 2, when the casseroles have stopped coming, and people start expecting recovery, as if grief had a return date stamped on it, the way a library book does. Time heals. All wounds gets repeated like a promise. Just wait. The pain has an expiration date built in. But time, on its own, doesn't do anything. It's not an active ingredient. It's a container. What happens inside it is what does the healing or doesn't. Psychologists studying bereavement have found that the same stretch of months can produce wildly different outcomes depending on what fills it. People who process the loss, talk about it, build new routines around the absence, tend to show real reductions in grief symptoms over time. People who avoid it, distract from it, or never get support often show almost no improvement at all. Even years later, some research on complicated grief finds symptoms that are functionally unchanged after a decade, just quietly carried instead of healed. Time passed identically for both groups. Healing didn't. There's a useful analogy buried in physical injury. A broken bone doesn't heal just because months go by. It heals because cells are actively laying down new tissue, and if the bone is set wrong, time doesn't fix that either. It calcifies wrong, permanently, and you end up with a wound that looks closed on the outside while staying broken underneath, the kind that aches every time it rains. grief researchers actually describe something similar. Unprocessed grief that gets buried instead of metabolized doesn't disappear with time. It just goes underground and resurfaces, often in a different shape, at the worst possible moment. So the comfort in "time heals all wounds" isn't false, because nothing ever gets better. It's false because it lets the person hearing it off the hook from the only thing that actually does the healing, which isn't waiting. It's the slow, deliberate work of letting the wound be tended to, instead of just left alone in a drawer marked later. Ignorance is bliss. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from not checking the test results, not opening the bill, not asking the question whose answer might change everything. For a while, it works. The not knowing feels almost like relief, a held breath that hasn't been let out yet, but at least isn't screaming. Ignorance is bliss, the old line says, as if not knowing were a room you could just decide to stay in forever. But the phrase has the timeline backwards. Researchers studying anticipatory anxiety, the dread of an unknown outcome, rather than a known one. Find something almost the opposite of bliss happening in that gap. The brain, deprived of information, doesn't default to calm. It fills the vacuum with worst-case simulations, running them on a loop, because uncertainty is metabolically more expensive for a nervous system to sit in than bad news actually is. There's a well-documented effect in medical psychology. Patients waiting for test results often report more distress during the waiting than after receiving an unfavorable diagnosis, because at least the diagnosis is a fixed shape. The unknown has no edges. It can be anything, and the brain, given that kind of freedom, usually picks the worst version available. There's also a quieter cost that compounds the longer ignorance gets protected. Avoidance has a well-studied feedback loop in anxiety research. Every time you avoid the thing that scares you, the relief you feel in that moment teaches your brain that avoidance works, which makes the next avoidance easier and the eventual confrontation harder. The bliss isn't free, it's a loan, and the interest accrues quietly in the dark, in the part of the mind that already half knows what it's avoiding and is just waiting for the bill to come due anyway. So ignorance doesn't actually buy bliss. At best, it buys a delay, dressed up to look like peace. The real bliss, the kind that doesn't curdle into dread at 3 a.m, usually shows up after the knowing, not instead of it. Bliss was never about staying in the dark. It was about getting through it to the other side, where the shape of the thing, however bad, finally stops moving. Honesty is always the best policy. There's a particular silence that follows a question someone didn't actually want answered honestly. "Does this look okay on me?" asked 5 minutes before walking into a job interview. "Or am I going to be all right?" asked by someone in a hospital bed who already suspects the truth and isn't ready to hold all of it yet. Honesty, delivered at full strength in that moment, isn't virtue. It's a blunt object, swung because the swinger felt better afterward, not because the other person needed the blow. Moral philosophers have actually built entire frameworks around this exact gap, the difference between honesty as a value and honesty as a delivery method, sometimes framed as the distinction between truthfulness and tact, where the content of what's true stays fixed, but the timing, the framing, and even the decision of whether the full truth is yours to deliver right now are separate moral questions entirely. Kant, famously, argued you should never lie, full stop, even to a murderer asking where your friend is hiding. And most people's gut reaction to that example is immediate, visceral discomfort. which is itself a kind of data. It suggests the moral intuition most humans actually run on isn't always say the true thing, but something closer to say the true thing in service of the other person's well-being, not in service of your own discomfort with holding it. There's research on this in close relationships too. Studies on what's sometimes called brutal honesty find that people who prioritize telling it like it is over reading the room or softening delivery tend to report more relationship conflict, not less, and are often perceived by partners as using honesty as a weapon rather than a gift, especially when the honesty in question was unsolicited in the first place. The information being true doesn't automatically make sharing it loving. A true thing, badly timed, can do real damage that a kinder, equally honest delivery would have avoided entirely. So the flaw in honesty is always the best policy isn't that honesty is bad. It's the word always doing more work than honesty can actually support, quietly skipping over every question of when, how much, and whether the truth being delivered is actually in service of the person receiving it, or just a release valve for the person finally getting to say it. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. There's a particular moment in a community college parking lot, a 63-year-old sitting in her car before her first computer class in 30 years, hands on the wheel, half convinced she's already too late for this. The phrase that put her there didn't come from nowhere. It came from a real, outdated piece of neuroscience that took decades to fully overturn. The old belief that the adult brain was essentially finished, wired once and fixed forever, with childhood as the only real window for learning anything new. That belief is simply wrong, and the discovery that broke it has a name: neuroplasticity, the brain's demonstrated ability to form new neural connections and reorganize existing ones well into old age. One of the most cited studies on this came from London cab drivers who have to memorize an enormous, tangled map of the city to pass the knowledge, a test so demanding it can take years. Brain scans found their hippocampus, the region tied to spatial memory, was measurably larger than in non-drivers, and the longer someone had been driving, the bigger the difference, regardless of age. The brain wasn't fixed. It was still being shaped by what it was asked to do, decades past the point the old theory said that window had closed. What does change with age isn't the capacity to learn, it's the speed, and sometimes the strategy. Older learners often pick up new skills more slowly than a 20-year-old cramming the same material, but they frequently retain it just as well, partly because they're drawing on a much larger library of existing knowledge to anchor the new thing to. Researchers studying adult learning call this leveraging crystallized intelligence. The old dog isn't worse at tricks. It's often just learning them by a completely different, occasionally slower, route. So the saying mistakes a difference in pace for a ceiling that was never actually there. The dog in the parking lot isn't too late. She's just going to learn the trick on a curve the textbook didn't account for, and the data these days is squarely on her side. Good things come to those who wait. There's a particular kind of waiting that looks like virtue from the outside. The person who didn't push, didn't ask, didn't apply, just trusted that patience itself would eventually be rewarded. The phrase makes waiting sound like a quiet form of effort, as if sitting still long enough were its own kind of work the universe was obligated to notice and pay out for. But look at where the saying actually came from, and the trick reveals itself almost immediately. It traces back to old advertising copy, a Heinz ketchup slogan from the early 1900s. selling the idea that their ketchup was worth the extra few seconds it took to pour, slow because it was thick with real tomatoes. The waiting being praised wasn't passive. It was a minor delay tacked onto a product people were already actively choosing to buy. Somewhere along the way, the slogan got stripped of that context and turned into a life philosophy it was never built to support. The research on patience and reward tells a much less comforting story than the slogan does. The famous marshmallow studies, often cited as proof that waiting pays off, actually measured something much narrower than general patience. They measured a child's ability to delay gratification when a reward was guaranteed to arrive. That's a completely different psychological event than waiting indefinitely for something with no guarantee attached at all, which is closer to what "good things come to those who wait" actually promises people in real life. Studies on goal pursuit consistently find that outcomes correlate far more strongly with active behaviors, effort, persistence, deliberate practice, than with passive endurance. Waiting by itself doesn't move probability. It just lets time pass, while probability does whatever it was already going to do. So the honest edit isn't "good things come to those who wait." It's something closer to what behavioral researchers actually find. Good things come to those who keep acting, and then have the patience not to quit before the acting has time to compound. The waiting was never the ingredient doing the work. It was just the thing happening in the background, while the real ingredient effort, repeated, was quietly doing its job. Opposites attract. There's a particular kind of couple everyone seems to know, the quiet one and the loud one, the planner and the wanderer, held up as proof that the universe pairs people in deliberate contrast, like it's running some cosmic matching algorithm built on difference. Opposites attract, the saying goes, borrowed straight from magnets, as if romance ran on the same physics as a horseshoe and a fridge door. But relationship researchers have spent decades testing this directly, and the data points almost entirely the other way. Studies on what's called assortative mating find that people overwhelmingly pair up with others who resemble them in values, education level, political views, even more superficial things like attractiveness and height, far more often than chance would predict. The psychological term for why similarity feels good isn't mysterious. It's sometimes called the similarity attraction effect, and the mechanism behind it is almost embarrassingly simple. Similar people validate each other. Agreeing with someone's worldview, their humor, their pace of life, feels like a quiet confirmation that your own way of seeing things is reasonable, and that confirmation registers, neurologically, as pleasant. The opposites couples everyone points to as exceptions usually turn out to be opposite in exactly one visible trait. Introversion versus extroversion is the classic one, while matching closely on everything underneath, that actually predicts whether a relationship lasts: core values, conflict style, how much affection they need, what they consider a deal breaker. Researchers studying long-term compatibility find that surface differences like personality type predict almost nothing about relationship satisfaction, while deeper alignment on things like honesty, ambition, and emotional needs predicts quite a lot. The loud one and the quiet one make a good anecdote precisely because the difference is visible. The 100 quiet agreements underneath it never make it into the story. So magnets attract their opposite poles because of a fixed law of physics neither one can override. People don't run on a law like that. They run on comfort, recognition, the relief of being understood without having to explain yourself first, and that almost every time is built far more on what two people share than on what keeps them apart. Love conquers all. There's a particular kind of fight that happens in the parking lot of a couples therapist's office. Two people who clearly love each other, who have never once doubted that, sitting in silence because love, it turns out, wasn't the thing standing between them and the problem. They're proof of something the old phrase quietly skips over. Love was never load-bearing. It's the feeling in the room. It was never the structure holding the room up. Relationship researchers who've spent decades studying what actually predicts whether a marriage survives have found, somewhat uncomfortably, that the amount of love a couple reports isn't a strong predictor of longevity at all. What predicts it is closer to skill conflict resolution style, the ratio of positive to negative interactions during a disagreement, whether contempt is present. One well-known body of research on married couples found that the presence of contempt, eye-rolling, sneering, treating a partner as beneath you, predicted divorce with striking accuracy, regardless of how much love either partner claimed to feel. You can love someone completely and still be terrible at the specific, learnable mechanics of not hurting them during a fight. There's a useful distinction buried in this that the phrase erases entirely: love as a feeling versus love as a set of behaviors. The feeling shows up uninvited, chemical, fast, dopamine and attachment systems lighting up the same circuitry triggered by other intense rewards. The behaviors: patience during conflict, consistency, repair after a mistake, the boring daily maintenance of actually showing up for someone have to be built deliberately, the way any skill is built, and they don't arrive automatically just because the feeling is strong. Couples therapists often describe this gap directly. By the time people show up in the office, the love is rarely the missing ingredient. The skill is. So love doesn't conquer all. Not because love is weak, but because conquering was never its job description. It's the reason two people choose to stay in the room together. What actually gets them through the war that follows distance, betrayal, the slow erosion of daily resentment, has always depended on something far less romantic and far more learnable. Whether they know how to fight fair, repair quickly, and keep choosing each other on the unglamorous days love alone never promised to show up for. Practice makes perfect. A kid sits at a piano for the 4,000th hour of scales, fingers moving through the same 5-note pattern they could now play half asleep, and somewhere in that boredom is the promise the phrase made years ago, that this repetition, eventually, arrives somewhere called perfect. Not better. Not closer. Perfect. As if enough repetitions of anything wear a groove deep enough to reach flawlessness, the way water eventually cuts stone. The first crack in the saying is definitional perfect doesn't actually exist as a finish line in any skill anyone's ever studied closely. Researchers who study expertise, most famously through what's known as the 10,000-hour idea, found something the popularized version of that research conveniently left out. The original study wasn't measuring practice leading to perfection. It was measuring deliberate practice, a specific, narrow kind of repetition involving constant feedback, deliberate targeting of weaknesses and discomfort, as opposed to just doing the same comfortable thing over and over. The violinists in that famous study who logged the most hours weren't just playing more. They were practicing in a way specifically designed to keep them at the edge of failure, not inside the comfort of what they'd already mastered. This is where practice makes perfect quietly misleads people into the wrong kind of practice entirely. Cognitive scientists studying skill acquisition have identified something called the arrested development effect, or more commonly, the plateau. The point at which a skill becomes automatic enough that further repetition stops producing improvement at all. A typist who's been typing for 30 years isn't meaningfully faster than one who's been typing for 5, once both have crossed into automaticity, because comfortable repetition trains the skill to require less attention, not to keep climbing. More reps of the same comfortable motion teaches the brain to do it on autopilot. Autopilot, by definition, stops improving. So the honest version isn't practice makes perfect. It's something closer to what the research actually shows. Deliberate, uncomfortable, feedback-corrected, practice makes progress, asymptotically, toward a ceiling that keeps moving the better you get, and perfect was never actually waiting at the end of it. There was no end, just a groove getting steadily harder to deepen, and the people who kept improving anyway were the ones still willing to feel like beginners, on purpose, long after comfort would have let them stop. The early bird catches the worm. There's a particular smugness baked into this one, the 5 a.m. riser, gym bag already packed, scrolling past everyone else's silence on social media with a kind of quiet superiority, as if the hour on the clock were itself a moral achievement. The phrase has survived for centuries as if it described a universal law of productivity: wake earlier, win more. But the proverb was never actually about virtue. It was about a worm that, biologically, happens to surface at dawn. The early bird wins because of when the worm moves, not because mornings carry some inherent superiority that night hours lack. Chronobiology, the study of the body's internal timing systems, has spent decades dismantling the idea that one sleep-wake schedule is objectively better than another. Everyone runs on a roughly 24-hour internal clock called a circadian rhythm, but the timing of that rhythm, called a chronotype, varies enormously between individuals, and a meaningful chunk of it is genetically determined, not a matter of discipline. Researchers studying chronotypes have identified clear categories, often nicknamed larks and owls, where owls don't hit their cognitive peak, alertness, and creative output until late morning or afternoon, no matter how early they force themselves awake. Forcing a genuine night owl into a 5 a.m. routine doesn't make them a productive early bird. It mostly just makes them a sleep-deprived owl, performing alertness on borrowed energy that has to be paid back later. There's a study worth sitting with here. Researchers tracking cognitive performance across chronotypes found that night owls forced to work against their natural rhythm showed reduced activity in attention-related brain regions and performed measurably worse on reasoning tasks in the morning, the exact window the early bird mythology treats as universally sacred. Meanwhile, that same owl, given the same task in the evening, often outperforms the lark. So the worm was never a metaphor for success. It was just a worm, surfacing on its own schedule, and the bird that caught it simply happened to be awake at the right moment for that specific prey. Catching your own version of the worm has less to do with which hour you wake up, and a lot more to do with whether you're awake during the hours your particular body actually knows how to hunt. Hard work always pays off. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't look like failure from the outside. Someone who's been at the same job for 15 years, first one in, last one out, who did everything the saying promised and is still watching someone else get the promotion, the raise, the recognition. The phrase told them the math was simple. Effort goes in, payoff comes out, reliably, like a vending machine. Nobody mentioned what happens when the machine is broken, or rigged, or simply doesn't have the prize you were owed sitting inside it. Economists who study labor markets have a less comforting name for the gap between effort and reward. Returns to effort aren't fixed, they're mediated by industry, by who you know, by which decade you were born into, by which body you happen to occupy walking into the room. Studies on wage growth consistently find that two people putting in identical hours, identical skill, identical output, can see wildly different outcomes depending on factors that have nothing to do with how hard either one worked. Geography, networking access, structural bias, even pure timing, like graduating into a recession instead of a boom. Hard work is one input into the equation. It was never the entire equation, no matter how good it feels to believe it is. There's a darker psychological cost buried in this one too, something researchers studying motivation call the just world hypothesis. The deep, almost reflexive need to believe outcomes are deserved, that the world distributes reward in proportion to merit, because the alternative is uncomfortable to sit with. The just world hypothesis doesn't just comfort the person who succeeded. It quietly blames the person who didn't, assuming they simply didn't work hard enough, when the actual cause might have been a market, a bias, a closed door that had nothing to do with their effort at all. None of this means hard work is pointless. It correlates with better outcomes on average, across almost every domain studied. But always is the lie. Hard work raises the odds. It doesn't guarantee the prize, and the people who internalize the guarantee version often end up doing something quietly cruel to themselves, treating every unrewarded year of effort as proof of personal failure, instead of what it usually actually is, then a vending machine that was broken from the start, no matter how many coins got fed into it. Knowledge is power. There's a particular kind of person who can recite facts endlessly, capital cities, historical dates, the boiling point of every element on the table, and somehow still feels powerless in the actual rooms that matter, the salary negotiation, the difficult conversation with a landlord, the moment a decision needs to be made, and made well. The phrase promised that simply having information was the whole transaction. Stack enough facts in your head, and power follows automatically, like gravity. But power, in any practical sense, has never been about possession. It's about deployment. Cognitive scientists studying the difference between knowledge and expertise draw a sharp line here. There's declarative knowledge, which is knowing that something is true, and procedural knowledge, which is knowing how to actually use it. A person can know, declaratively, every principle of negotiation ever written, and still freeze the moment a real negotiation starts, because the knowing and the doing live in genuinely different systems, and one doesn't automatically produce the other. Studies on expertise transfer find this gap constantly. People with extensive theoretical knowledge in a domain frequently underperform people with less raw information, but far more practiced, applied skill, because applied skill is what actually moves outcomes in the room. There's also a structural problem the phrase quietly ignores. Who gets to act on knowledge at all? A brilliant insight held by someone with no platform, no resources, no access to the people who make decisions, doesn't behave like power in any functional sense. It behaves like a locked door with the key sitting just out of reach. Sociologists studying institutional power have long pointed out that information without access, resources, or the social standing to act on it tends to just sit there, inert, while someone with less knowledge but more positional power moves the actual outcome. So the honest correction isn't knowledge is power. It's closer to what the saying's own quiet contradiction reveals. Knowledge is potential power, the same way a battery sitting on a shelf is potential energy. It does nothing on the shelf. It only becomes power once something, skill, access, the nerve to act on it, closes the circuit and lets it actually move something in the world. Actions speak louder than words. There's a particular silence that sits between two people after one of them says, "I love you" for the first time, and the other one just keeps doing the dishes, keeps showing up on time, keeps quietly fixing the broken thing without being asked. Proof, supposedly, that actions are the real currency, and words are just noise filling the air until behavior catches up. The phrase sounds like wisdom because it's correcting something real. People do lie with words far more easily than they lie with sustained, costly behavior over time. But somewhere in repeating that correction for centuries, the phrase swallowed something true about words it shouldn't have. Communication researchers studying relationships have found that words aren't actually separate from actions at all. They're a type of action, one with its own measurable behavioral signature. Saying, "I appreciate you" out loud, regularly, isn't decoration layered on top of appreciative behavior. Studies on relationship satisfaction find that verbal expressions of affection and gratitude independently predict relationship quality, even when controlling for supportive behavior, meaning the words are doing real, separate work that the actions alone don't cover. A partner who does everything right but never says anything affirming out loud often leaves the other person quietly starving for something behavior was never built to supply, the specific, irreplaceable feeling of being told, not just shown. There's a useful distinction from attachment research that explains why. Humans don't just need to infer love from behavior. Inference takes work, and under stress or insecurity, people are notoriously bad at reading ambiguous behavior accurately. Verbal affirmation closes that gap directly, with none of the interpretive labor. This is part of what's behind the popular framework of love languages. Some people genuinely register affection more reliably through words of affirmation than through acts of service, not because they're shallow, but because their particular nervous system trusts the explicit channel more than the inferred one. So the honest edit isn't actions speak louder than words. It's that actions and words are answering two different questions. Actions tend to prove that something is true over time, while words tend to confirm it in the moment it's actually needed. A life built entirely on one and starved of the other isn't more honest. It's just incomplete in a direction that's easy to mistake for strength. You only live once. There's a particular bathroom mirror moment, someone about to do something reckless. A tattoo at 2 a.m., a credit card maxed out on a flight booked an hour from now, where the phrase gets whispered like permission, like a loophole found in the fine print of an otherwise cautious life. You only live once, as if scarcity were the same thing as license, as if the fact that something is rare automatically means it should be spent carelessly. But notice the strange logical trick the phrase is quietly running. The rarity of life is true, and it's also the exact same fact that should produce the opposite conclusion. Economists who study decision-making under scarcity have a concept for this called opportunity cost. Every choice made with a finite resource forecloses every other choice that resource could have gone toward instead. If you genuinely only live once, that doesn't argue for spending the resource carelessly. It argues for spending it especially deliberately, since unlike money, there's no earning more of it back once it's gone. The phrase borrows the weight of scarcity to justify the opposite of what scarcity actually implies. There's a behavioral economics finding that explains why the impulsive version feels so persuasive in the moment anyway. Something researchers call present bias, the tendency for the brain to wildly overvalue an immediate, vivid reward, the tattoo, the trip, the rush, compared to a string of smaller, distant outcomes, the debt repayment, the steady relationship, the slow-built career, that don't fire the same dopamine response in the moment of deciding. YOLO doesn't override present bias. It dresses present bias up in a philosophy, so the impulsive choice feels like meaning-making, instead of what it usually actually is: a nervous system taking the path of least resistance and calling it courage. The people who actually seem to be living fully, by any measure that holds up over decades, rarely look like the bar bathroom version of the phrase. They tend to look like people who took the scarcity of life seriously enough to build something slower skill, a relationship, a body of work, precisely because they understood there wasn't a second life waiting to absorb a wasted one. You only live once isn't an argument for recklessness. Read correctly. It's the single best argument against it. Always trust your gut. There's a particular feeling, a tightness low in the stomach, a hesitation before a decision that can't quite be explained, that gets treated in this phrase as a kind of oracle. Something ancient and wise, bypassing all the slow, fallible machinery of conscious thought and arriving straight at the truth. Trust your gut, as if instinct were a sense organ for facts, the way eyes are for light. Some of that reputation is earned. Researchers studying expert intuition firefighters, chess grandmasters, ER doctors have found that gut feelings in these populations are often startlingly accurate, and the mechanism behind it isn't magic. It's compressed pattern recognition. A chess grandmaster's gut sense that a position is dangerous is actually thousands of previously studied games, collapsed into a feeling that arrives faster than the conscious reasoning that originally built it. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who spent a career studying this, found something crucial. Expert intuition is only reliable in domains with consistent, learnable patterns and fast, clear feedback. Chess, firefighting, medicine practiced over years. Take the same confident gut feeling out of that domain into stock picking, into reading a new acquaintance's character in 5 minutes, into predicting which startup will succeed, and the accuracy collapses to roughly chance, even though the feeling of certainty remains exactly as strong. That's the trap hiding inside, always. The gut doesn't come with a disclaimer attached, telling you which domain you're standing in when the feeling arrives. It feels identical, whether it's built from 10,000 hours of relevant pattern recognition, or from nothing more than a stereotype, a recent fear, or last night's bad sleep dressed up as a hunch. Kahneman's research on cognitive biases found that gut judgments are frequently hijacked by exactly these irrelevant inputs: anchoring, availability, mood, without the gut ever signaling that anything's gone wrong. Confidence and accuracy, it turns out, are almost entirely unrelated feelings, generated by completely different processes, and the gut only reliably reports the first one. So the honest rule isn't always trust your gut. It's closer to trust it in the domain where it was actually built, through repetition, feedback, real expertise, and treat it with real suspicion everywhere else, no matter how loud or certain it happens to feel. The gut was never lying about how confident it was. It was only ever an open question whether that confidence had earned the right to be believed. Never give up. There's a particular image the phrase loves to summon the inventor who failed 1,000 times before the light bulb worked, the underdog who refused to quit and won anyway. It gets told as if persistence were the entire variable separating success from failure, and quitting were always, in every case, a kind of moral defeat. Never give up, not sometimes reassess, never. But economists who study decision-making have a blunt name for what never give up quietly enables: the sunk cost fallacy. The tendency to keep pouring resources into something specifically because you've already poured resources into it, rather than because the thing still makes sense going forward. The money, the years, the effort already spent are gone either way. They can't be recovered by continuing. Rational decision-making asks one question only: does this still look worth it from here, regardless of what's already been sunk? And never give up actively interferes with asking that question honestly, because giving up gets coded in advance as failure rather than as data. There's research on this exact tension among entrepreneurs. Oddly enough, one of the populations most associated with relentless persistence. Studies tracking startup founders find that the ones who succeed on a second or third venture are disproportionately people who quit a failing first venture early, while they still had capital, energy, and time left to redeploy somewhere more promising. Not the ones who exhausted everything trying to resurrect something the market had already rejected. Researchers studying goal pursuit describe a related skill called goal disengagement, the capacity to actually let go of an unreachable goal, and find that people who are better at disengaging from goals that have genuinely stopped being viable report better mental health and redirect their energy more successfully than people who can't release a goal once they've committed to it. None of this contradicts what's true about grit. Psychologist Angela Duckworth's well-known research on perseverance really did find that sustained effort toward long-term goals predicts achievement better than raw talent does. But even that research draws a quiet distinction. The slogan erases. Grit is persistence in service of a goal that's still alive, still responsive to effort. It was never a blanket argument for refusing to update when the goal itself has changed shape or died. So the honest edit isn't never give up. It's closer to keep going as long as the effort is still buying you something real, and treat the decision to stop when the evidence says stop, not as surrender, but as the exact same skill persistence is just aimed, for once, in the other direction. Failure is not an option. There's a particular kind of room this phrase gets quoted in: a locker room before a championship game, a mission control center during a crisis, a motivational poster above someone's desk, and in all of those rooms, it sounds like resolve. Like the sheer refusal to accept failure is itself a kind of force field. But notice what the phrase is actually asking the brain to do. Not avoid failure, but refuse to even let it exist as a category of outcome. And brains, as it turns out, don't have an off switch for categories. They only have attention, and attention obeys a strange, well-documented rule the phrase walks directly into. Sports psychologists call it ironic process theory, sometimes summarized by the old experiment about not thinking of a white bear. Try not to think of something, and the mental act of suppressing it requires actively monitoring for the very thing you're trying to avoid, which keeps it lit up in working memory the whole time. Athletes told don't choke, golfers told don't hit it in the water, tend to perform worse on exactly that outcome, not better, because the instruction to avoid an outcome forces the brain to keep modeling that outcome in vivid detail just to know what to avoid. Failure is not an option. Does the same thing at a larger scale. It doesn't erase failure from the mental model. It makes failure the loudest thing in the room, dressed up as a rule instead of a fear. There's a related cost that shows up specifically under high pressure, something researchers call choking under pressure performance failures, that happen because of excessive self-monitoring, driven by the stakes, not despite preparation. NASA's own Apollo 13 history, ironically the event that made the phrase famous, is usually told backwards from how it actually worked. The engineers in that room didn't succeed by refusing to imagine failure. They succeeded by methodically enumerating every way the mission could fail, and solving each one specifically as a process that required holding failure in mind constantly, in granular, unflinching detail, not banishing it from the room. So the honest version isn't failure is not an option. It's closer to what actually saved that mission. Failure is not the acceptable ending, but it has to remain fully, vividly on the table as a possibility examined, planned around, prepared for, because the only way to actually prevent it is to look directly at every shape it might take, instead of declaring, by decree, that you simply won't look. If at first you don't succeed, try again. There's a particular image of a kid relearning to ride a bike, falling, scraping a knee, getting back on, falling again in the exact same spot that the phrase was probably built for. Repetition, applied with stubbornness, eventually produces balance. It's a clean, satisfying story. The problem is what happens when the same advice gets applied somewhere that isn't a bicycle, a relationship that keeps ending the same way, a business pitch that's been rejected 19 times using the identical deck, an exam failed twice using the identical study method. Try again, taken literally, just means fail again, with extra steps. The flaw hiding in the phrase is that it specifies repetition but says nothing about variation. Researchers studying skill acquisition and problem solving distinguish sharply between what's sometimes called blocked practice, doing the same thing the same way, over and over, and what's called the trial and error learning loop, which only actually produces improvement when each attempt is informed by feedback from the one before it. Without that feedback loop, repetition doesn't converge on success. It just produces the same failure, more times, with more confidence behind it, each round, something behavioral scientists studying this pattern sometimes call the definition of insanity problem, only half-jokingly, because the colloquial version of that line, expecting different results from identical actions, describes almost exactly what unmodified repetition produces. There's a useful contrast in how this actually works in domains that study failure rigorously engineering, for instance, where failure analysis is a formal discipline. A bridge that collapses doesn't get rebuilt identically and tested again, hoping for a different outcome. Engineers study precisely why it failed, change the specific variable that caused the failure, and only then rebuild. The trying again isn't the active ingredient. The diagnosis sitting between attempt 1 and attempt 2 is. So the honest edit isn't try again. It's fail, diagnose, adjust, try again. A phrase that doesn't fit nearly as well on a poster, but matches what actually separates the kid who eventually rides the bike from the person on their 20th identical rejection letter, still convinced that one more identical attempt is what persistence was supposed to mean all along. Don't judge a book by its cover. There's a particular dating profile moment, a photo, a job title, a single line of bio, where someone makes a snap judgment in under a second, decides yes or no, and then feels mildly guilty about it afterward, like they've violated some rule of fairness they were taught as a kid. Don't judge a book by its cover. The moral logic seems airtight. Covers are surface, character is depth, and depth is the only thing worth trusting. Except the phrase asks people to ignore something psychologists have repeatedly found is actually working better than the saying gives it credit for. Psychologist Nalini Ambade ran a famous line of research on what she called thin slicing judgments made from extremely brief exposure, sometimes just a few seconds, of silent video. Subjects watching only 6 seconds of a teacher's nonverbal behavior with no audio rated that teacher's effectiveness with startling accuracy, closely matching ratings from students who'd sat through an entire semester. The cover, in that case, wasn't noise distracting from the truth. It was carrying real, compressed signal posture, micro-expressions, tone that the brain was reading correctly, fast, well before conscious reasoning caught up. There's also a structural reason covers aren't arbitrary, something economists call costly signaling theory, the idea that certain visible traits are expensive or hard to fake, which is exactly what makes them informative. A worn, well-organized toolbox signals real experience precisely because faking that wear convincingly would take more effort than just having the experience. A cover isn't randomly slapped onto a book. Publishers spend real money making sure it accurately telegraphs genre, tone, and audience, because a cover that lies about its contents gets returned. None of this means first impressions are infallible. They're frequently hijacked by genuine bias, stereotype, and noise that has nothing to do with the person's actual character, and that failure mode is real and well documented. But the fix was never ignore the cover entirely. It's closer to what the research actually supports. Treat the cover as a fast, fallible, statistically better than chance hypothesis, worth forming, and then stay genuinely willing to revise it the moment the actual pages start telling a different story. Be the bigger person. There's a particular moment after a conflict. Someone's been wronged, clearly, provably wronged, and everyone around them, meaning well, says the same thing. Be the bigger person. Let it go. Rise above it. Don't respond to their level. It sounds like maturity, and sometimes it is. But notice what the phrase quietly requires of the person who was actually hurt. That they absorb the cost of someone else's bad behavior alone, with no expectation that the other person changes anything at all. Psychologists who study forgiveness have actually drawn a sharp, important line that be the bigger person tends to blur completely the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness, in the research literature, is an internal process, releasing the grip of resentment for your own psychological benefit, regardless of whether the other person ever apologizes or changes. Reconciliation is something else entirely, restoring trust, restoring access, behaving as though the relationship is fully repaired. Be the bigger person routinely collapses these into one instruction, implying that releasing resentment should come bundled with continuing to extend trust and access to someone who hasn't actually earned it back. There's research on what happens when people skip straight to performing the bigger person role without doing the internal work first, something close to what's sometimes called premature forgiveness, where someone suppresses the anger outwardly, presents as gracious, but never actually metabolizes the underlying hurt. Studies on suppressed anger find it doesn't disappear just because it stops being expressed. It tends to resurface later as resentment, passive aggression, or a kind of low-grade emotional fatigue that the person can rarely trace back to its source, because they were never allowed, even by their own standards, to call it what it was in the first place. There's also a quieter incentive problem buried in the phrase, something behavioral economists studying social dynamics would recognize immediately. If the person who behaves badly faces no cost, and the person who was wronged is the one expected to absorb the discomfort and perform graciousness on top of it, the phrase doesn't actually produce more maturity in the room. It just produces an asymmetry, where bad behavior gets quietly subsidized by whoever's willing to be the bigger person about it. So the honest edit isn't be the bigger person. It's closer to what the research actually separates out. Release the resentment for your own sake, on your own timeline, but reserve trust, access, and reconciliation for the much narrower set of people who've actually demonstrated they've changed. Being bigger was never supposed to mean being a doormat with better posture. What goes around comes around. There's a particular comfort people reach for after watching someone cruel get away with something. A co-worker who lies their way into a promotion. A partner who cheats and somehow lands on their feet. And the phrase arrives like a quiet promise that the universe is keeping a ledger somewhere, and the debt always eventually comes due. What goes around and comes around. Nobody has to act. The math just resolves itself, given enough time. But look at what the belief actually requires underneath it. Some mechanism, somewhere, tracking moral behavior and converting it into proportional consequence, a kind of cosmic accounting system with no documented accountant. Social psychologists studying this exact belief call it the just world hypothesis. The same instinct underneath. Everything happens for a reason, and it shows up here in a slightly different costume. Researchers have found the belief isn't neutral, it does real psychological work, and not all of it good. Studies on victim blaming find that people who score high on just world belief are more likely to assume a victim of misfortune. A crime, an illness, a financial collapse must have done something to deserve it, because the alternative, that bad things sometimes land on good people for no proportional reason at all, is harder to sit with than blaming the victim is. There's also a selection effect quietly propping the belief up, something close to confirmation bias running on a long time scale. When a cruel person eventually faces a consequence, fired years later, divorced, estranged from their kids, the believer files it under karma, confirmation received. When the same cruel person dies wealthy, respected, and surrounded by people who loved them, having faced no consequence at all, that case usually just doesn't get mentioned, doesn't get filed anywhere, because it doesn't fit the story already being told. Nobody's actually counting both columns. Only the column that confirms the belief gets counted. None of this means kindness and cruelty are inert. There's real research on reciprocity, the documented human tendency to return treatment in kind, which produces something that looks like karma in social systems, because people genuinely do tend to treat kind people better and avoid known cruel ones over time. But that's a social mechanism, built by other people's memory and behavior, not a cosmic one. The honest version isn't what goes around comes around on its own. It's what goes around comes around when, and only when, other people are paying close enough attention to make sure it does. Which means the universe was never the one keeping the ledger. People were, and people, unlike the universe, get distracted, forget, or just don't notice in time. The customer is always right. There's a particular kind of employee who's absorbed 1,000 small humiliations over a career in retail or hospitality, each one justified by the same 5 words taped to the wall behind the register. The customer is always right. It gets treated as gospel, a founding principle of good business, ancient and self-evidently true. Except the phrase has a known author, a known original context, and a meaning that got quietly amputated somewhere on its way to the break-room wall. The line is usually traced to Harry Gordon Selfridge, the department store magnate, who coined a version of it in the early 1900s as a sales philosophy, essentially an assume good faith with customers instead of treating them like suspects, a genuinely useful corrective at a time when shopkeepers commonly accused customers of theft or dishonesty on sight. It was never intended as a literal claim about factual or moral correctness. It was a posture toward trust, not a verdict on every dispute. Somewhere in a century of repetition, assume good faith calcified into the customer cannot be wrong, which is a completely different, far more dangerous claim on that nobody actually tested before adopting at scale. Organizational psychologists who study workplace stress have found real, measurable costs to taking the literal version seriously. Research on emotional labor, the unpaid work of performing pleasant emotions you don't actually feel, required heavily in service jobs, finds it strongly associated with burnout, job dissatisfaction, and even physical health costs like elevated cortisol, particularly when employees are required to absorb mistreatment without any institutional backing. A policy that tells employees the customer is always right, even when the customer is abusive, dishonest, or simply factually mistaken, removes the one thing that makes emotional labor sustainable: institutional support when a customer crosses a line. There's also a business outcomes problem the phrase ignores entirely. Studies on customer service quality have found that employees who are empowered to use judgment, including occasionally telling a customer no, tend to produce better long-term customer satisfaction and retention than employees forced into blanket compliance, partly because blanket deference trains the most demanding, occasionally abusive customers to escalate further, having learned that escalation always wins, while it simultaneously drives away good employees who eventually burn out and leave. So the honest edit isn't, the customer is always right. It's closer to what Selfridge actually meant before the phrase got sanded down to a slogan: assume good faith first, listen seriously, and reserve actual deference for the customer who's right, which, it turns out, was never automatically all of them. Sleep is for the weak. There's a particular badge of honor people wear around exhaustion: the founder posting at 3 a.m., the student bragging about an all-nighter, the executive who claims to run on 4 hours and a willpower nobody else seems to have. The phrase frames sleep as a kind of tax on the weak, something the truly driven simply opt out of. Except sleep researchers have spent decades demonstrating something close to the opposite. Skipping sleep doesn't look like discipline under a microscope. It looks like impairment, and it looks like it fast. One of the most cited findings in this space compared performance after extended wakefulness to performance while legally drunk. Researchers found that staying awake for roughly 19 to 20 hours straight produced cognitive and motor impairment comparable to a blood alcohol level around the legal driving limit in many countries. Nobody calls a person who shows up to work drunk disciplined. The sleep-deprived version of the same impairment routinely gets praised as grit, mostly because the impairment is invisible to the person experiencing it. One of the cruelest features of sleep deprivation is that self-assessed performance stays falsely confident, even as actual performance craters. So the exhausted person genuinely believes they're operating fine while objectively failing the task in front of them. There's also a specific cost hiding in exactly the trait sleep deprivation is supposed to be a sacrifice for performance. Studies on sleep and cognition find that adequate sleep, particularly the deep and REM stages, is when the brain consolidates memory, clears metabolic waste through what's called the glymphatic system, and restores the prefrontal cortex's capacity for focus, judgment, and emotional regulation. Cut that process short repeatedly, and the resulting extra hours of wakefulness get spent in a degraded cognitive state, producing measurably worse decisions, slower problem solving, and more errors. The math frequently works out so that the sleep-deprived hours produce less usable output than the sleep itself would have, not more. So the phrase doesn't just glamorize a sacrifice. It misidentifies what's actually being sacrificed. Sleep was never the weak option, being traded away for strength. It was the maintenance period. The strength was quietly depending on the whole time, and skipping it doesn't toughen the machine. It just runs the machine on damage it hasn't had time to repair yet. No pain, no gain. There's a particular gym moment the phrase was practically engineered for someone pushing through a set, jaw clenched, treating the burn in their muscles as proof the workout is working, because pain and progress got fused into the same sensation somewhere back in gym class. No pain, no gain. The trouble is that the phrase doesn't actually distinguish between two completely different signals the body is capable of sending, and conflating them sends people directly toward injury. Exercise physiologists draw a careful line here between two kinds of discomfort that feel adjacent but mean opposite things. There's the burning, fatiguing sensation of muscle under productive load caused by metabolic byproducts building up during exertion, the genuine signature of a muscle being pushed toward adaptation. And there's sharp, localized, joint or tendon pain, the kind that signals actual tissue damage, not adaptation. The first kind is the gain the saying is gesturing at. The second kind is just an injury introducing itself, and pushing through it doesn't produce more gain. It produces a setback that often takes the gains already made and erases them during weeks of forced recovery. There's research on how this plays out specifically in athletes who've internalized the slogan too literally. Studies on overtraining syndrome find that ignoring pain signals chronically doesn't accelerate progress. It produces a measurable decline in performance, immune function, and hormonal regulation, sometimes taking months to reverse. The body doesn't have an unlimited supply of adaptation to draw on. It has a finite recovery budget, and pain, in its sharper form, is one of the only direct messages the system sends when that budget's being overdrawn. There's also a quieter problem in what the slogan implies about gain itself, that more discomfort linearly produces more progress, when exercise science actually describes something closer to an inverted U, a controlled, moderate dose of stress placed on a system that then gets adequate rest produces adaptation. Push well past that dose, especially without adequate recovery, and the curve doesn't keep climbing toward more gain. It bends back down toward injury and burnout, the exact same shape researchers found earlier when looking at psychological resilience under extreme stress biology, repeatedly prefers a curve to a straight line. So the honest edit isn't no pain, no gain. It's closer to no productive discomfort, no gain. And sharp pain is your body's way of telling you that you've crossed out of that zone entirely. The slogan wasn't wrong that growth requires some discomfort. It was wrong to flatten two very different signals into the same word, and then tell people to push through both of them identically. Fortune favors the bold. There's a particular pitch-meeting moment the phrase gets quoted in someone about to make a reckless bet, mortgage the house, quit the stable job for the idea nobody's validated yet, and the Latin original gets invoked like ancient permission. Fortes fortuna adiuvat. Fortune favors the bold. It sounds like a law of probability itself rewards courage, as if boldness were a lever the universe was specifically built to respond to. But notice the same trap sitting underneath this one that sat underneath, if you can dream it, you can achieve it. Survivorship bias, just wearing a different costume. The bold people who got featured, quoted, turned into the proof of the saying are the ones whose boldness happened to pay off. Researchers studying entrepreneurial risk-taking have pointed out that for every founder who bet everything and won, there's a much larger, much quieter population who bet everything and lost, and that population doesn't get keynote speeches or magazine profiles. The phrase isn't measuring whether boldness causes fortune. It's measuring which bold people happen to get lucky, and then crediting the boldness for what was substantially luck. There's a sharper distinction economists studying risk draw that the saying completely flattens: the difference between calculated risk and reckless risk. Calculated risk involves real boldness, acting despite uncertainty, but paired with actual analysis, hedged downside, and a realistic read of the odds. Reckless risk just looks the same from the outside, minus the analysis. Studies comparing successful versus failed entrepreneurial ventures consistently find the deciding variable usually isn't the amount of boldness involved, but whether the bold move was actually informed, market research done, downside genuinely understood, a real plan for what happens if it doesn't work, versus boldness as a substitute for that homework, mistaking confidence for due diligence. There's also a quieter selection effect worth noticing. Bold moves that fail usually fail quietly, privately, off the record, while bold moves that succeed get amplified loudly, repeated as parables, until the parable starts to feel like statistical evidence instead of what it actually is, one outcome out of many, retroactively declared inevitable. So the honest edit isn't fortune favors the bold, it's closer to fortune favors the informed bold and ignores the rest, just less visibly. And the version of boldness actually worth admiring was never the blind kind. It was the kind that did the unglamorous homework first, and only then went ahead and bet. When one door closes, another opens. There's a particular hallway moment this phrase tries to soothe someone standing in front of a closed door, a layoff, a rejection, a relationship ending, staring at it like it's the only door in the building, and the saying arrives with a gentle promise. Don't worry, there's another one, somewhere, already swinging open. It's meant to comfort. But notice what it quietly implies about the universe's architecture, that doors open and close in some kind of balanced, automatic sequence, like a building with a fixed number of exits that simply rotates which one happens to be available. That's not how opportunity actually behaves, and there's a useful piece of psychology explaining why the phrase, taken too literally, can become a trap instead of a comfort. Researchers studying decision-making describe something called the paradox of passive optimism, the belief that good outcomes will simply arrive on their own schedule tends to reduce the active search behavior that's usually required to actually find them. If you genuinely believe the new door is already open somewhere, swinging gently in a hallway you haven't found yet, there's less psychological pressure to go looking for it, pry open a stuck one, or build a door where none currently exists. The metaphor, designed to comfort, can quietly produce passivity disguised as faith. There's also a much darker version of this gap worth naming honestly. Sometimes no door opens. Not every layoff leads somewhere better. Not every breakup clears space for a healthier relationship. Researchers studying resilience after major setbacks find that people who fare best aren't usually the ones who passively waited for an equivalent replacement to materialize. They're the ones who treated the closed door as a genuinely difficult loss, grieved it honestly, instead of immediately reframing it as secretly good news, and then did the effortful, often unglamorous work of building a new option from materials that didn't arrange themselves. So the honest edit isn't, when one door closes, another opens. It's closer to, when one door closes, sometimes there's another one already ajar nearby, and sometimes there's just a wall, and the difference between those two outcomes usually isn't fate quietly rebalancing the hallway. It's whether someone was willing to put in the unglamorous, undramatic work of finding, or literally building, the next door themselves. You have to hit rock bottom before you can grow. There's a particular myth embedded in recovery stories, the addict who finally gets clean only after losing everything, the burned-out executive who only changes after a complete collapse, repeated so often it starts to sound like a law of human nature instead of one narrative pattern among many. You have to hit rock bottom before you can grow. It treats catastrophe as a prerequisite for change, as if the only door into transformation runs straight through total ruin. Addiction researchers have actually pushed back hard on this exact belief, because in clinical settings, it has a body count attached to it. Studies on substance use treatment find that waiting for someone to hit rock bottom before intervening, sometimes called the let them crash first approach, correlates with worse outcomes, not better ones, partly because rock bottom for many people is death, or close enough to it that recovery becomes far harder, not easier, by the time it arrives. Early intervention research consistently shows the opposite of what the saying implies. People who get support, structure, and motivation to change before losing their job, their relationships, their health, tend to have significantly better long-term recovery rates than those who are left to fully collapse first. There's a psychological concept that explains why the rock-bottom myth feels true anyway, even though it's a poor predictor of outcomes. It's a vivid story, and vivid stories are dramatically overrepresented in how change gets told, even when they're statistically rare in how change actually happens. Researchers studying behavior change point to something more mundane and far more common as the real engine. Incremental shifts in self-efficacy, small wins that build belief in one's own capacity to change, long before any catastrophic flaw gets hit. It's just a much worse story to tell at a podium. I made a series of small, boring adjustments before things got unbearable. Doesn't headline a memoir the way I lost everything and rebuilt from the ashes does. So the honest edit isn't, you have to hit rock bottom before you can grow. It's closer to, rock bottom is one place growth has been known to start, mostly because crisis sometimes forces attention that nothing else could, but it's neither necessary nor especially efficient. And the people who wait for it, instead of building the smaller, earlier kind of change available right now, are often just gambling with how much they're willing to lose before they're finally willing to start. Just think positive. There's a particular hospital bed, a particular layoff notice, a particular grief that someone is handed, fresh, and the people around them meaning well, uncomfortable with the silence, offer the same 3 words like a tool that's supposed to fit every lock. Just think positive. as if the problem in the room were the thinking, not the actual circumstance, and fixing the thinking would somehow retroactively fix the circumstance too. The research on forced positivity tells a stranger story than the slogan assumes. Psychologists studying what's called toxic positivity, the blanket suppression of negative emotion in favor of relentless optimism, have found it doesn't just fail to help. It actively interferes with processing. Studies on emotional suppression find that people instructed to push down negative feelings rather than acknowledge them show increased physiological stress markers, not decreased ones, elevated heart rate, higher cortisol, even while reporting outwardly that they feel fine. The body keeps score. The mind has been told to stop tracking. There's a related finding that cuts even closer to the bone of why just think positive backfires specifically. A famous, somewhat uncomfortable study on self-esteem and positive self-talk found that people with already low self-esteem who were instructed to repeat positive affirmations, "I am a lovable person," said aloud, daily actually felt worse afterward than a control group who said nothing at all, because the gap between the affirmation and what they actually believed about themselves became the most salient thing in the room, not the affirmation itself. Forced positivity doesn't erase the negative belief underneath. It just adds a second, dissonant belief on top, competing for the same mental real estate. What the research finds does help is almost the opposite. Move something psychologists call acceptance-based coping, or more specifically, accurate emotional labeling, naming the difficult feeling precisely, out loud or in writing, rather than overriding it. Studies on affect labeling find that simply naming an emotion accurately, "I'm scared," not "everything's fine," measurably reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat response center, in a way that forced positivity never manages to replicate. So the honest edit isn't just think positive. It's closer to think accurately, first name the fear, the grief, the anger, precisely. Let it be real, and only then, once it's been acknowledged rather than buried, does genuine, durable optimism have anywhere stable left to grow from. Money can't buy happiness. There's a particular discomfort in saying the obvious thing out loud, that the person living paycheck to paycheck, one car repair away from disaster, generally isn't comforted by being told money doesn't matter to well-being, mostly because it demonstrably does, right up to a point. Money can't buy. Happiness gets repeated most often by people who already have enough of it to stop thinking about it, which is itself a kind of evidence the saying conveniently ignores. The actual research on this is more precise than the slogan, and more interesting. The widely cited early work from economist Angus Deaton and psychologist Daniel Kahneman found that emotional well-being rises sharply with income up to a certain threshold enough to cover security, food, housing, health care, the structural sources of chronic stress, and then the curve flattens, with additional income above that point buying noticeably less additional happiness. That flattening is real, and it's probably where the saying's grain of truth comes from. But a more recent, larger study by researcher Matthew Killingsworth, using real-time mood tracking instead of retrospective surveys, found that happiness doesn't actually plateau the way the original research suggested. It keeps rising with income, just more slowly, all the way up the income scale, with no clear ceiling found even among very high earners. When the two research teams compared notes directly, they found the discrepancy wasn't really a contradiction. It came down to a specific subgroup. For most people, happiness does keep climbing steadily with income, but for one group, People who were already unhappy for reasons unrelated to money. More income stopped helping past a certain point because the source of their unhappiness wasn't financial in the first place, which is itself the real finding, hiding under the slogan, "Money buys happiness reliably," when the unhappiness was caused by financial insecurity. It does almost nothing when the unhappiness was caused by something money was never built to fix: loneliness, grief, a failing relationship, a body in chronic pain. So the honest edit isn't "money can't buy happiness." It's closer to "money buys happiness exactly as well as it solves the specific problem money is capable of solving," and the saying only sounds wise to the people for whom that problem was never the one keeping them up at night. Age is just a number. There's a particular reassurance offered to anyone nervous about turning 40, 50, 60, a milestone birthday, a candle count that suddenly feels symbolic, and someone leans in with the line meant to dissolve the whole anxiety in one sentence. Age is just a number. It's offered as a kind of universal exemption, as if the body simply declines to participate in time the way the calendar insists it should, and the only thing actually aging is the arbitrary digit on a form. The trouble is that biologists studying aging have spent the last few decades discovering something that makes the slogan both more true and more complicated than it sounds. There's a real, measurable distinction in the research between chronological age, the number, counted in years since birth, and what's called biological age, a separate measurement based on cellular and physiological markers, inflammation levels, telomere length, how efficiently organs are functioning, how the body actually responds to stress. Two people born the same year can have biological ages that differ by a decade or more, driven by sleep, diet, movement, chronic stress, and genetics. In that narrow, technical sense, the slogan is closer to accurate than it sounds. The number on the birth certificate really is a weaker predictor of how a body is functioning than people assume. But notice what gets quietly smuggled in when the phrase gets stretched from biology into everything else. Relationships, decision-making, risk-taking, the idea that age carries no real information at all. Developmental psychologists studying lifespan changes find specific, well-documented cognitive shifts that do track with chronological age fairly reliably, independent of how fit or sharp someone feels. Processing speed peaks and begins a slow decline, starting around the mid-20s, for instance, even while crystallized knowledge and judgment, built from accumulated experience, often keep improving well into later decades. Age isn't just a number in the sense of carrying zero information. It's closer to a number that predicts some things reasonably well, predicts other things barely at all, and gets used constantly as a lazy stand-in for things it was never actually measuring in the first place: vitality, relevance, capability, desirability. So the honest edit isn't "age is just a number." It's closer to "age is a number that measures exactly one thing, precisely time elapsed, and almost everything people actually mean when they invoke it. Capability, attractiveness, worth, was never really about the number at all. It was about the biology and the choices riding underneath it, which the birthday candle count was only ever a rough, often misleading proxy for. Follow your heart. There's a particular crossroads moment people imagine when they hear this 1-2 job offers, 2 people, a stable path, and an unstable pull, and the advice arrives like it's pointing toward some organ in the chest that actually knows things the rational mind doesn't. Follow your heart. The phrase borrows the heart's old reputation as the seat of feeling, going back centuries before anyone understood what the heart actually does, which is pump blood on a schedule, with no access to information about job offers or anything else. What people actually mean by heart in this context is emotion, and neuroscience has a much stranger story about where that emotion lives in decision-making than the slogan implies. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio studied patients with damage to a specific area of the prefrontal cortex, the part that integrates emotional signals into reasoning, and found something that initially seems to support trust your gut over your head entirely backwards from how it's usually told. These patients, with their emotional processing damaged but their logical reasoning fully intact, didn't become superior rational decision-makers, free of messy feeling. They became nearly incapable of deciding anything at all, endlessly listing pros and cons for trivial choices, like which pen to use. Because emotion, it turns out, isn't noise interfering with good decisions. It's a necessary input. Damasio called the mechanism somatic markers, gut-level emotional signals that flag certain options as worth pursuing before slow conscious reasoning even finishes its analysis. So emotion isn't the heart's rebellion against the mind's logic. It's part of the same system, feeding it. Which means follow your heart isn't wrong to value feeling. It's wrong to treat feeling as a separate, superior authority that logic should simply defer to. The patients who lost access to emotional input didn't become better reasoners. The people who let feeling override every other input risk, consequence, the people depending on them don't tend to fare much better either. Decision scientists studying this integration find that the best outcomes come from neither pure logic nor pure feeling alone, but from a back and forth between them, each checking what the other might be missing. So the honest edit isn't follow your heart. It's closer to let your heart cast a vote, because it's carrying real information your conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet, and then let the rest of you, the part that can think about tomorrow, actually count that vote alongside everything else in the room, instead of handing it the only ballot.